This week, the Fantasy Ruckers are breaking down the breakdown stats this week. We talk about if turnovers and steals at the ruck should join the Fantasy Major League Rugby mix. The Fantasy Ruckers show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 37 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. As always, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, Devin Vanderpool not here on this episode, but that's okay.
Man, I mean, look, this guy comes on last week, breaks, he helps us break the Joel Hodgson news, this big signing that he's been talking about for the Utah Warriors. Mikey, I mean, we'll get to it, but Mikey Tail leaves, and now Vandy's nowhere to be seen. I don't know what we're going to do with this guy, but it seems like this guy just comes on, breaks some news. Somebody leaves. Last time, I think it was Quatrin that got traded to the Free Jacks, and then Vandy didn't come on. So, hey, Utah Warriors, you got a diehard fan. This guy can't even get up out of bed when somebody leaves the team. So
yeah, I've got two underlying theories here, Matt. I got either one, he really is an insider and he's just so busy with trying to build up his connects in the MLR and he's really trying to spur things here, and that's why he's always first on the know when it comes to certain roster moves here on the Fantasy Ruckers Show. And he continues to tease it and say, hey, I got my sources. So I don't know, maybe he's not lying about that. The other thing that I'm more leaning on about that has a higher probability of being a thing is that, yeah, I think there is a correlation between these Utah Warriors decisions and roster moves and things like that, and his, I guess, feeling towards those decisions and him appearing on this show. Hey, I think there is a correlation there. So. Third
theory, he's training. He's training to get he's in the Utah Warrior building training. And that's how he knows all the insider stuff, because he's in the building, moving weights, picking stuff up, putting them down. And that's what he does. And he's trying to get out there to be on that Utah Warrior squad.
And hey, yeah, maybe give the guy credit. We're going to talk about it in the news and notes here in just a moment's time, but they did just announce the Crossroads Cup in Utah. So, hey, maybe Vandy's getting ready for a little bit of Crossroads Cup
Vandy
action.
Will have to cross a few more roads than some of those other guys, but hey, he'll do it. He'll do it.
The heart and the dedication is there for Vandy. But yeah, we'll miss the guy this episode, but he'll be back definitely very, very, very shortly. But for those of you who maybe this is your first episode tuning into the Fantasy Ruckers Show, thank you for tuning in. Like we said at the top of the show, trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. You want to follow us at the Fantasy Ruckers on social media, on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. We're everywhere. We're also on Discord. We got a great community there as well. The link to join that community is down below in the description. Those are the places that you'll want to check out if you want to be first to know about fantasy rugby in the MLR. And hey, maybe we'll be able to expand this thing a little bit soon. The season is slowly but surely approaching. We're still a little bit ways out here, Maddie, but definitely coming close. Fantasy football is in full swing. It's only getting my taste buds even more wanting the fantasy rugby scene to return. And before you know it, it will definitely be back around. So yeah,
and
for
hey,
all of you listening,
just to add a quick
there.
one to the intro. I mean, if you're from the MLR and you're watching, you can still send us an email. You can still send us a fax, and you can still send us a letter, and we'll still pay for postage. So hey, just throwing it out there. Now that we got it out, cat's out of the bag last episode, you can still do it. The line's still open.
Sure, yeah. And for those of you who didn't catch last episode, the Ask TFR show question was how we could kind of close in that gap between fantasy rugby and fantasy football. Vandy's answer was kind of integrating fantasy rugby a little bit more into those MLR broadcasts. Yeah, and we mentioned that we're right here, and we're more than willing to offer that fantasy rugby perspective to the MLR. Yep. Yeah, and we'll even pay for postage, like Matt said. But yeah, moving on here, guys. Let's talk about some of the latest news and notes that's happening across the league. I feel like so much has happened over the past week. It's crazy.
Look, and Jam Delay, the guy that we love and we rely on, friend of the show, basically, MLR stats. He had to do 2 pages this week.
2 pages this week. Yeah. And we're in the height of the off season here, and it doesn't feel like it with all these roster moves. So yeah, we're gonna try to break it all down here for you. We're gonna list out a bunch of the names, and then we're going to then talk about how it's going to have a fantasy impact here. Some obviously having more impact than others. Let's talk about the one that's probably gonna have the biggest impact, at least not only in this week when it comes to roster moves, but probably the entirety of this off season. That is the trade between the Utah Warriors and the San Diego Legion. Mikey Teo is returning to his old team, the very team that he won MVP on not too long ago, a couple campaigns ago, and he is going to San Diego in exchange for Jonah Dietenberger and 2023 cap considerations going the Utah Warriors way. Before I even get into any of the details, Matt, just overarching reaction with Mikey Teo going back to the San Diego Legion.
Yeah, I mean, good on Utah, first of all, for what's it called? Allowing him to go back home to where he's from, going back to San Diego, closer to his family. I believe that was part of his request, and they lived up to it. So great on. Just talks about the absolute class of an organization that the Utah Warriors are. But hey, look, the last time that Mikey Teo played for San Diego Legion, like you said, won the MVP. Maybe we're going to see a revival. And I think it's safe to say that in terms of fantasy and in terms of scoring, Mikey Teo maybe didn't have the best year that maybe some guys expected, especially being kind of one of the top picks in the draft. Maybe this is the revival. Maybe this is kind of he's back home. He's back close to his family. That's what he needed. He's going to come back and have another MVP-like season that we know that he can have.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, very good on the Utah Warriors kind of living up to their word there. But I feel like there's a lot of moving parts here. There's also, where is Mikey Teo going to fit here on the San Diego Legion, who is going to replace, I guess, all that production from Mikey Teo on the Utah Warriors. So let's get into it. Let's talk about more specifically the fantasy impact and where these values and where these numbers and where these points are now going to shift to with the movement of Mikey Teo to California. Let's start off with the San Diego Legion side, because obviously you're starting with Mikey Teo. Guys played, for the most part, fullback. He has made appearances at the wing position as well. When you look at the San Diego Legion roster, you're looking at guys like obviously Joe Peterson, who's been a staple of the San Diego Legion, who had played fly half for a large portion of previous campaigns, but last season really making the appearance at the fullback position for a large majority of the season, outside of a stretch here towards the middle end where he had about 3 weeks in a row, even a scrum half appearance there in the middle there at that fly half positions. But that was, I believe, due to the injury that happened to Will Hooley, who is their starting fly half. So Matt, I ask you, with Will Hooley expectedly to be their starting fly half for the San Diego Legion, obviously Joe Peterson is still there as we know of right now. You would assume that he would still slot in at that fullback position. Is Mikey Teo just moving into that winger position, just adding another scoring threat to San Diego, or is there more here that we need to look into?
No, I think that's probably going to be the move. I mean, again, I think the one thing that we need to point out every time that we're looking at the lineups is that, we really don't know for sure who's going to be back when and who's back on the roster. I mean, let's pretend that old man Joe is returning and nothing's changing. I think, Will Hooley, every time he made an appearance at 10, he looked good. Joe Peterson, a natural 15. I think he also works there. And I mean, Mikey Teo, I think he fits perfectly on the wing there. Allows him to kind of just use his speed, use his power that we know that he has, score some more tries. And we can see probably him, Matthias Fryer, and Joe Peterson kind of rounding out that back three.
Yeah, and it is interesting because when you start looking at the roster for San Diego, you can kind of see where maybe that hole is for Mikey Teo to slot in there. Guys that they had starting at that wing position on either side. You had Bjorn Basson that was there. Matt, you mentioned it. Matthias Fryer spent a large portion both at the fullback position and subbing in and starting at that wing position. And then also a late bloomer there in the season, Thomas Aoki as well, making that push into that San Diego Legion 15 side.
Yeah, and fantasy-wise, I mean, maybe this is something to look out for, that, hey, those are all quality back three guys that all had fantasy impact because of the fact that, that back three was it Matthias Fryer, Bjorn Basson. They really were the wingers that played most of the season. Maybe we need to be a bit more careful now, the fact that they have so much quality in that back three. Maybe Joe Peterson takes a bit more rest. Maybe the wingers are kind of switching in and out depending on who's in form and stuff like that. So maybe something to look out for. And despite the potential for him to have another MVP-like season, maybe see him drop in the draft, drop in the rankings just strictly because of playing time.
Sure. And we'll talk about some of the points here. Mikey Teo, for the entirety of the 2022 MLR fantasy season, was able to rack up 51.8 total fantasy points during that 2022 campaign. That was good enough for 27th overall in the fantasy rankings. So he was definitely up there making an impact. We'll see whether or not he'll be able to transition that to the San Diego Legion. The big question remains there, Maddie, is whether or not that production can still stay up for a lot of these players. Bjorn Basson, 42.7 total fantasy points. Joe Peterson, 104. He was a staple of fantasy rugby last season. So if he is going to sit on the bench maybe a little bit more, get a little bit more rest. Vanny said it all season last year. Old man Joe, that guy's going to need some rest at some point. It might be the MLR, but when you're going up in age, especially plus the 40s, you're definitely going to need a little bit of extra rest. So that we might see that 104.6 value go down a little bit. That's something that drafters will need to consider heading into the 2023 year. And then Thomas Aoki, who mentioned 32.6 total fantasy points, and then also Matthias Fryer, who you mentioned, Matt, also racked up 50 fantasy points. So there's a lot of fantasy points to be had. You mentioned on the San Diego Legion side, it's just now figuring out how is this going to be distributed. If it is really Mikey Teo just transitioning to that starting role, it should be a pretty good pick for whoever is going to select Mikey Teo next year.
I forget who was at 13 at outside center for San Diego Legion. I don't remember who was kind of their starting 13.
Let me pull that up for you.
But while you're
Thomas Morani started at the outside center for the beginning of the season, and then it transitioned more to Tian Lutz.
Okay, so I'm just throwing this out there. Can you imagine a Nanu Teo midfield?
Oh man, we talked about the barrels and the size, of Mikey Teo and the size of Ma Nanu. That would be incredible, man.
That would be something. I'm just throwing it out there. Maybe not the best, but hey, if that ever happens, that will be a sight to see.
Sure. Yeah. But you're also talking about a Utah Warriors team that also had Paul Lasike, and they had the opportunity to have maybe a big boy center line there with maybe moving Mikey Teo there as well. Obviously, different circumstances. Utah Warriors having some other players there at that center position, like Tyler Fisher and things like that. So maybe not making that transition as smooth.
Great segue though. Look, this also has implications for the Utah Warriors, right? And I think you were about to say it. And I think we talked about it a little bit last show about, where does McEnany fit? Where does Joel Hodgson fit now with his addition? And now I think it's pretty clear, right? Joel Hodgson fits in at that first five, that fly half position. And then McEnany, perfect fit, fills in Mikey Teo's spot at 15. Still provides that same explosiveness, still provides that same attacking threat. I basically they've answered our question with this trade.
Sure. Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself there. Quickly to wrap this up nicely with the bow, Maddie. In terms of draft stock and value, in terms of these players, if I know we're going to break down a lot of the stats, but just taking into the rankings that we had last season and the same fantasy stats that we had last year, just to keep it all status quo here. What are we thinking here? Mikey Teo's draft value going up here, going to the San Diego Legion. And then what are we thinking about the perspectives of Joel Hodgson that you just talked about?
Yeah, look, I would draft Mikey Teo with caution. That back three is getting pretty busy. There's a lot of guys in that back three, and like you're listing out the points, all of those guys had over 45 fantasy points, and like that's top 30, top 35 kind of rankings, and that's quality. Those are guys that are on teams. They're finding spots in our league. So look, I don't know if he's going to go as high as last year. Definitely won't go as high as last year. But he's still maybe a quality guy to pick up, somebody who may have more opportunity to score tries because there's more talent around him. Sure. And then regarding Joel Hodgson, I think I said this last show, but look, I am drafting this guy with high hopes. If anything, I'm sure he'll be an absolute nail off the boot. But then again, look, the guy's coming with class, the guy's coming with experience. If there's anything that we learned from Joe Peterson, a guy who's also coming from experience and also coming from class, is that those guys have a way of making an impact in the MLR.
Sure, and that's both in just a rugby perspective and a fantasy perspective.
Exactly.
So, it'll be interesting to see. One quick thing to add there as well. If running meters is something that we do add into upcoming seasons. All I'll say is that Mikey Teo is one of the players that is going to benefit greatly by that stat, just the way that guy moves around the ball. Whether or not those are positive running meters, you know what I mean? He's sometimes losing himself on the field there a little bit, but nonetheless, though, he's definitely a guy that knows how to run the ball.
The barrel's going to move where the barrel's going to move. You can't control it. You just got to go with the flow.
Exactly. All right. So that was the biggest roster move, I would say, of the last week here. One that I also want to now talk about here is what the heck is going on with the NOLA Gold and their scrum half position? Because the NOLA Gold have signed former Hurricane scrum half Luke Campbell. And this is for those of you who are maybe not in tune with the MLR offseason. This is a team in the NOLA Gold that has already drafted Sebastian Villani. They already have Damian Stevens on the roster, who was looking really, really good towards the tail end of the 2022 MLR season. They add another 9 to the mix here, Maddie. I know you showed off the Hurricanes logo there. I know you're a fan of the Hurricanes, but what does this mean for the NOLA Gold scrum half room? And is this a positive impact here for the NOLA Gold that maybe they didn't foresee coming? Maybe they didn't know they were going to get Luke Campbell.
Yeah, I mean, look, first off, I'm going to say that Luke Campbell is going to be the starting 9 for this NOLA Gold team. If without any, unforeseen circumstances like visas and stuff like that, he's going to be the starting 9 for this NOLA Gold team. The guy comes with, Super Rugby experience. The guy is like, he's a quality player. Even those guys that if you get a cap in Super Rugby and you're able to perform in Super Rugby level, you can surely perform in the MLR level at a high level. I mean, what this really says for me is got me thinking, and I posted this in the Discord chat, was how many quality 9s does one team need? And to me, what that points out is that, hey, what's going on with Damian Stevens, right?
Sure.
Are we for sure that he's coming back? Why would NOLA Gold work so hard and exhaust so many resources towards bolstering the halfback position if they knew that they were getting Damian Stevens back? I have a feeling that maybe Damian Stevens is going somewhere. Maybe they're unsure of what his status is. So that's kind of my inkling. But hey, if they keep all 3, Villani's going to have a great room to kind of develop from. But if I'm going into this, look, I'm drafting Luke Campbell and seeing him as one of the quality 9s in this league.
Sure. And for me, it's an interesting one because I think this shows a lot in terms of how teams view certain aspects of the MLR. First, obviously, NOLA Gold may be in this situation. Maybe the second pick in the MLR draft is not as highly rated as maybe we think it is. Maybe it's just an opportunity for a team to trade up, get a guy that they want, and maybe not a guy that they think was going to start instantly, but a guy that they see can develop over a long time. Use the expertise and the experience that Luke Campbell has. Use, if Damian Stevens does stay, obviously his experience in the MLR and really develop Sebastian Villani. And then, hey, you now come in with a guy that has Super Rugby experience for at least a year or so, and he comes in and really makes you a competitor at that halfback position. So yeah, just it's an interesting move. It's just crazy to think that the NOLA Gold may have 3 top tier 9s in the MLR that obviously you can't play all of them at once. And they'll have to sort out how that kind of judge rolls. But you mentioned Luke Campbell's the hands down starter. Yeah.
And I mean, look, Luke Campbell, if you're looking for a 9 in the draft, I'm going to say that Luke Campbell's going to be one of the first halfbacks off the board. When you come from Super Rugby, when you come from that kind of style of play, he learned from TJ Perenara, one of the greatest try-scoring halfbacks that there is. He's gonna have that same kind of impact, run those same type of support lines, and he can be, a big fantasy contributor. What I will say is just outside of fantasy is that this is potentially great news for the U.S. men's national team development. I mean, Villani, obviously a U.S. eligible, I believe, but being able to develop Villani behind Damian Stevens, guys like Luke Campbell, I mean, what a fantastic way to kind of develop that young talent, and what a fantastic way to kind of use the draft in order to help not only bolster your MLR team, but bolster the national team as well.
Sure. And I want to just also mention when it comes to the Nola Gold and the roster moves that they're making, obviously they added Luke Campbell here at the 9 position. And just last week, we talked about in the previous episode, they added Rodney Iona, a fly half. So that pairing may look really, really nice. And that could be something that fantasy managers will want to look at because, you talk about a lot of fantasy points, a lot of experience, a lot of skill there. That's something that sounds like I want to get in on.
Yeah, let's expect Nola Gold to be a different team. You start at developing that 9 and 10. You build that around your 9 and 10, and the rest comes together. They've got two quality halfbacks. They got a quality first 5. They're set. I think they're going to be a different looking team this upcoming year.
Yeah, so 2 pretty big moves here that is definitely going to have an impact here in the fantasy world, that's for sure. Again, Mikey Teo, a guy that had huge fantasy impact. We'll see Joel Hodgson coming in, what he's going to be able to do, and now Luke Campbell joined the Nola Gold with that whole 9 situation there, and then also adding Rodney Iona last week. 2 teams that I think are going to have differing fantasy opinions than what we had going into the last season with. I'm going to just roll out here with the rest of the roster moves here to quickly go through this, Matt. If any of these kind of pop out to you just stop me and we'll have more discussions about it. We mentioned about the partnership that the Toronto Arrows have created with the Scottish club overseas, Melrose Rugby. More players of theirs are going overseas and taking advantage of that partnership. Again, we've mentioned it countless times on this show. Really good to see that players here in the MLR are getting opportunity to develop in more notable leagues and established leagues overseas and get that experience. Mitch Richardson and James O'Neill of the Toronto Arrows both going over to Melrose Rugby. Oh, really? Nice. That's good to hear. We talked about Joel Hodgson, but also other Utah Warriors move. Lance Williams is returning to the Utah Warriors, so that is good to see. Lance Williams is a back row player that had a huge fantasy impact, 51.5 total fantasy points last season, finished 30th overall in the entirety of the fantasy rankings. When you had a back row player in your lineup, that was able to score that number of points really gave you an advantage on a week in and week out basis. So he'll look to do that again in 2023 for the Utah Warriors. Ronan Murphy and Peyton Talea Alalio, they're joining I believe the American Raptors. For those of you who have been following the MLR for a long time, this was a team that I believe was originally called the Glendale Raptors. They've turned into a touring side, an American kind of all-star team. It looks like they're just trying to get rugby reps. So they are joining that team, at least for the offseason. We'll keep an eye on that. Stan South, Corey Daniel, Jameson Fanana Schultz, they're all returning to Old Glory DC. Good to see that. Connor Grindell joining the Toronto Arrows from overseas. He's coming from the Gordon Rugby Shoot Shield. And Canadian then a couple eligible. Canadian eligible as well. Pat O'Toole re-signing with the Nola Gold. Mitch Wilson also re-signing with his team as well, the New England Free Jacks. He was a guy that was kind of those boomer bust kind of try scores. Vandy had him on his fantasy team, so he'll look to do that again on the New England Free Jacks. And then lastly here, a little bit of a trade between the Toronto Arrows and the Seattle Seawolves. The Arrows acquiring Travis Larson for 2023 cap consideration that will go Seattle's way. Not really anything that big, guys that really didn't have a fantasy impact. And then lastly, Seattle continuing to pile on the salary cap considerations. They also moving Brad Tucker to Rugby New York as well. So
I believe the other one, Ryan, is also Josh Larson. Josh Larson, or one of the Larsons, is going to the Toronto Arrows.
Travis Larson. I just mentioned.
Okay, I clearly
just mentioned Travis. Salary cap considerations. Travis Larson. There we go. Brad Tucker. Both going away from the Seattle Seawolves. Larson going to the Arrows. Brad Tucker going to Rugby New York, all for salary cap considerations. Last one here that's come up. Isaac Ross is not returning to the Austin Gilgronis. He signs with a Japanese 5th-tier club, which is interesting there. He'll look to continue his rugby career overseas.
I'm sure that Japanese team has an owner at least,
Yeah. So who knows? But hey, roster moves. We might be in the top level off season here when it comes to the MLR, but it doesn't feel like it because the only thing
that I wanted to point out was, I'm going to be honest with you, I was a little bit surprised that old banana Fanana Schultz got re-signed. That guy played 4 games last season because of all the suspensions that he had. I'm surprised because, to me, discipline is one of the things that, and every penalty and every suspension that he got was just a heinous act that, you don't want to see in the game. So I'm a little surprised there. he is a quality player, just seems to find himself in the sin bin quite a bit. So yeah, that was kind of the only one that stood out to me, and I kind of raised my eyebrows and said, oh, interesting.
Yeah, 6 total appearances in 2022, 5 of them being starts, and again, dealing with those suspensions. Missed.
I mean, it wasn't that he wasn't good enough. That's why, that's not why he didn't play. You know, it's because the MLR said, "Hey, stop punching people in the face when they're not looking."
Yeah, missing 6 games in the middle of the season there, including his bye week, and then 3 games towards the end of the season. So yeah, definitely not one you see, especially as a fantasy manager, because you want your guys in your lineup scoring you fantasy points, something that Jameson Fernandez-Schultz did not do for fantasy managers last season. Moving on from roster moves, just to wrap up the news and notes portion here. One thing that I want to mention, we talked about it towards the top of the show, joking about that Vandy obviously heard a whiff of this, but the Crossroads Cup being organized by the Utah Warriors. It's a cup that is going to be a month-long competition that's focused on finding players from that Utah region, the Intermountain region, that can then enter into the Warriors pathway and to help develop them. I think just a really cool way for the Warriors to find other talent that's in the area, because I think that's what it's all about, especially as the MLR continues to grow, finding local talent, giving ways for players who are looking to go professional when it comes to rugby, giving them opportunities to show their talent, show their skills, and find a way onto a developmental side, and eventually onto a starting MLR side, because I feel like collegiate isn't the only way to go here. There's many other creative ways that that teams can go about it to find that talent, and obviously the Utah Warriors finding that creative way to do that. So we'll see whether or not we'll see Vandy in the Crossroads Cup here to make his bid for a MLR roster spot. We'll see whether or not
we'll find out,
that's possible.
But interesting to see how these different teams are approaching developing their players and finding players as well. So
yeah, it is really cool. I mean, just recently, obviously we're a big lurker on r/MLR Reddit. Just looking at all the news and notes there, seeing what people are talking about, seeing what the latest like hot topics around Major League Rugby is. And one guy actually posted in there that what is the best way for a D1 rugby player to join a MLR team? And people were like asking, hey, do this, find out, join this side, join that. And it's just cool to see that the MLR is still at the stages where they're trying to find how these teams are going to find their talent. You got guys that are even posting on Reddit that are looking for ways to get on an MLR team. So hey, MLR teams, if you're listening, there's definitely people out there that are wanting to get that opportunity. It's just figure out a way to give them that opportunity and find ways to do that. So interesting stuff. And then lastly here, just a little shout out to show kind of the impact that former MLR alumni are having in the rugby world. Jamie McIntosh, a former Austin Gilgronis player and coach, and former All Blacks prop as well. He's going to join the Hurricanes as part of their coaching lineup. So just a little bit of MLR ties there. Obviously a big force there over in New Zealand. It's cool to see that he was able to at least establish a little bit of his expertise and experience over here in the MLR during his long rugby career. So miss anything? I don't know, man. There's so many roster moves, dude. It's crazy.
There's so much, and there's other things that I could say, but look, let's keep it moving. Let's get on with it. I know we got some good stuff to get into, so let's keep it moving, right?
Absolutely. All right. Well, it's time to continue our deep dive into the stats that we were able to get our hands on for the 2022 year. No longer are we just about tries, scoring meters. What else did we have? A try assist. We're
not
more
enough.
than that.
That's what we had.
Not enough. Exactly. We needed even more. And we've been over the past few weeks been diving into those stats and seeing which one of those categories, or which out of all the categories, are we able to kind of integrate and establish into the fantasy MLR world. 2 episodes ago, we went into meters gained. Last episode, we went into tackles. So just really good stuff, or vice versa. I think we went to tackle. So much numbers, so many numbers.
Look,
that
we
are going
went
into
the numbers. That's what happened.
Exactly. So we mentioned it at the top of the show. We're starting now to fine tune some of these categories. And I think the conversation was always there. We were going to want to add tackles, we were going to want to add meters gained. It's now starting to look into some of these smaller categories to see whether or not they have a place in the world of fantasy rugby. And we mentioned it towards the end and teased it towards the end of last episode. But today we're hopping in to break down steals and turnovers. And Matt and I were having this discussion before we started this show. And I don't think, first going into this and having a initial overlook at the numbers and what the tallies were for the 2022 season when it came to how many turnovers and how many breakdown steals players were accumulating, I think we need to go into this, Matt, that this is not going to be a stat that's going to be end all break all. This is not going to be a stat that is going to win people's that is not going to alone win people's weeks. Yeah. But it may decide people's weeks, and that's what we want to add into this fantasy rugby element. We want to, keep different metrics, keep people on the edge of their chair, and I think breakdown steals and turnovers might be something we want to look into to get into that.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing that it does is it adds value to some of the players that are specializing in this, right? You look at guys like Lucas Rumble, you look at guys like Mike Smith. I mean, these guys were guys that were, up there in tackles, but they didn't only tackle, right? They also are master at the breakdown. They know how to get their hands in there. They know how to cause turnovers. They know how to cause havoc. It just gives another way for guys to add value to this and creates a deeper pool of players that have a different way of scoring points based on their expertise.
Sure. And I think we've had this conversation throughout the entirety of this journey of breaking down these stats over the past month or so about trying to integrate these stats into fantasy rugby in the best way possible that is going to reflect the best players that are on the field and how they perform in real rugby, right? We want the best players in fantasy rugby to emulate, maybe not at a one-to-one level, or maybe not exactly in a mere exactly one for what it is, but at least a general kind of area where the best top 10 players are the best top 10 players in rugby. And I think part of that, Matt, is highlighting different players' expertise or different players, what they're known for doing. And I think in our past season, we were really highlighting the try scorers, right? A lot of the try scorers were getting an advantage. Now that we've introduced meters gained 2 weeks ago, we're now highlighting the ball carriers that are in our league, right? Adding tackles. We're giving players who don't just score tries, we're giving them the opportunity to shine in the world of fantasy rugby. We're allowing those different archetypes of a rugby player, because it's not all about scoring tries when it comes to rugby. We all know that, and if you're listening, you definitely know that. And it's by implementing that, and like you mentioned, Matt, by implementing breakdown steals, it is rewarding those guys that, in addition to tackling, scoring tries, the guys that are really working hard around the breakdown, they're getting rewarded as well. The thing that I think is going to be interesting as well, implementing this, is the turnover points, because it's something that I'm kind of on the fence of integrating. We had this conversation, and Matt, I know your opinion on reducing fantasy points. We want to add fantasy points. We want to get people to score points, because that's what gets fantasy managers and people playing fantasy sports excited, when there are fantasy points being added, not necessarily taken away. But I thought that if you're going to add breakdown steals, it is only fair to not only reward the people that are causing those mistakes, it's also penalizing the people that are not only losing the ball at the breakdown, but also just making errors on a regular basis. So what's your overarching theme about the turnovers, not just the breakdowns? Yeah,
look, I mean, there's so many, and especially when you're talking about, turnovers at the breakdown, there's so much more than just an individual player can do, right? I can, if I make a line break and nobody's there to support me, and somebody causes a turnover and steals a ball after I get tackled, what am I supposed to do, right? Like, I only have so many options to do without any support. That becomes more of a team almost turnover, but one guy's getting penalized for it, right? But then again, that's how it is in all the sports, all the fantasy. Sometimes there is multiple things that go into a turnover. Somebody just has to get binned for it. But at the end of the day, I think you said it yourself. I am not supporting kind of taking away points for turnovers. I think it just happens so often in rugby specifically that it'll just work against, I think, what our goal is and trying to increase the amount of excitement and points that we have surrounding our league.
Absolutely, for sure. All right, well, let's get into the numbers and let's start breaking down some of the guys that are going to take advantage of the most if we were to add. Let's start off with the breakdown steals stat category and talk about kind of the guys that are really going to shine when it comes to this. When it came to a point value, assigning a point value to breakdown steals, I thought it was something that needed to be rewarded. Breakdown steals don't necessarily happen often, or I shouldn't say that. They do happen often in a game. However, the amount that a player will tally up in a singular game is not going to be like tackles, where on a regular game that a guy is going to rack up, 5 breakdown steals every single game. There are going to be guys that have an act at being able to steal those breakdowns, but it's not going to be a guy that's going to be regularly.
And hey, if you've got a guy that's getting 5 breakdown steals a game, you better draft him and you better pick him up because that guy is going to get you points.
Exactly. So naming off the top, let's say top 6 here, because I want to include all the guys that were able to get double-digit breakdown steals this past season. Not going to break it down by position here because I think just an entirety of breakdown steals. Not many people are getting breakdown steals.
Yeah, look, you're going to get to the wingers, you're going to get to the 10s, the 9s, and it's going to be like the top person had 2 on the season, and we don't need to go into that.
Exactly, but I do think though there is going to be a little bit of a surprise at which positions were stealing at the breakdown the most. I think that, Matt, you and I can agree on that. We would expect that the back row position would probably have the most steals at the breakdown just because they're probably most around there. That is literally their job. Be first there, poach the ball. That is what they do. If you had to guess another notable position that tend to get a lot of breakdown steals, who would you go with?
Center.
Wow, you're right, dude. You played the sport or something, eh?
I played the sport a little bit.
What makes you say center position?
Hey, look, center is just a back row, just in the backs. So
true.
They're big bodies. They happen to be around the breakdown. And I mean the big thing is that the center position is the guys that are usually going to make that first hit offset piece. And hey, they get their head in there. They get their hands dirty. A quality center will get their head in and steal the ball a time or two.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's name the top 6 here. You guys have been waiting it. So the top 6 breakdown stealers of the 2022 MLR season: Lucas Rumble, Danny Barrett, Lance Williams, Dan Creel, Brendan O'Connor, and JP Duplessis. So out of those, you got 2 centers there between Dan Creel and JP Duplessis, the rest being back rowers. I could have guessed that Lucas Rumble was going to be the top guy there. He's been
how much did Lucas Rumble get?
15 breakdown steals for the entire 2022 season.
And what was the next guy?
Danny Barrett was 14. And then there was a little bit of a separation there. Lance Williams and Dan Creel both getting 11. And then Brendan O'Connor and JP Duplessis at 10.
I mean, hey, Lucas Rumble, man, that guy, that's 15. That's almost a steal a game, I think. Yeah. Or more than a steal a game. That's if we're looking at 2 points, like you said, you need additional 2 points every week. Let's just say you're losing a matchup by 1 and you have Lucas Rumble in there and you're ready. You're like, hey, he's guaranteed to steal this game. I'm going to be pretty confident that this guy is going to get a breakdown steal. And hey, it was hard to watch an Arrows game without seeing him at least get at least 1 or at least force a penalty at least once.
Sure. And I think that's what we got to look at it by hearing those numbers, right? You're talking about the guy who led the league in breakdown steals is only tallying up 15 for the entirety of the season. And you mentioned it, Matt, perfectly there, that you're averaging there around 1 per match. This is a stat category that is not, like I mentioned earlier, not going to, carry your win that week, but it may decide it because the difference may be because you have Lucas Rumble as opposed to another back rower that isn't, regularly getting steals, and you end up on that week getting that extra 2 points that you need, and you squeak out a win by 1, Matt. I mean, you were a guy that experienced it firsthand.
I was having a hard time getting points. So if there's anybody that you need to talk to about being desperate for points, it is me. And I mean, like, I was trying to, and I think, I'll speak for the league, that as many guys, as long as you can get as many guys on your team to not get 0 points last season, that would meant you're going to have a good week, So the fact that you can almost guarantee that Lucas Rumble's going to get 2 points for you in a given week, I mean, I'll take it. And that shoots his draft stock up right up there.
Absolutely. And yeah, it should be interesting to see how kind of that breakdown steals category would have, you know, the effect in the moment of a matchup. I think it's easy for us to look back here and be like, oh yeah, the entirety of the season he's averaging 1 per game, so he would get, you know, 2 points every single week, as opposed to other guys. You know, those things happen in spurts. So, you know, there may be 1 week where he gets 3 steals and we don't even know, and he's racking up 6 points just based on steals. Then you add the tackles that we might add to that, plus the meters gained. Hey, I'm starting to like the idea that we're gonna have a little bit of points here in 2023.
And what I'm thinking about right now is watching MLR games and seeing, you know, one of the players that I have get their head into a ruck, put their arms on the ball, just be sitting there, and me just get up and start getting jacked up because I know that he's about to get a steal, and that's 2 points in the book. You know,
well, I mean, Matt, that's one of the most, like, during our playing days, that was one of the most, like, hype things about whenever you got a breakdown steal and you got the ref blowing the whistle and pointing the arm the other way, people were hype, and I can only imagine the reaction you get from fantasy rugby too.
Oh, it's got, I mean, it was one of the best things. You're down in there, you got the ball, nobody can see you, right? Oh, everybody can just see your butt sticking up in the air. The whistle blows, and next thing you know, you see this head pop up with the ball and just celebrating, just getting crazy, knowing that he just caused a penalty and turned the ball over. Yeah, I'm going to have the exact same celebration when I'm watching the games.
Well, then that's the great thing, right? That's the great thing about fantasy rugby or fantasy sports in general, is that you don't have to be the one that's digging your head in there and taking a few hits and taking a few shots there. You can save your shoulders. You can save your back. You can be sitting on your couch and you're going to be just as hype as the players on the pitch there when that breakdown still happens. So yeah, definitely a plus when it comes to adding a category here. And yeah, definitely a chance for more points to be had on the field when it comes to the fantasy rugby season. When you're adding points, though, you also got to keep in mind that there is also an opportunity to also take away points. And we mentioned turnovers here. Yeah. Gonna have to start talking about it here. I know you don't necessarily like the idea of removing points here, Maddie, but the big question being, should players be penalized for things as far as handling errors, for things as far as turnovers in the breakdown that we just mentioned, any turnover at all? Is this something that we need to be penalizing players for? Matt, you quickly mentioned about how, you know, not every turnover is the fault of that individual player, but in other fantasy sports, there are stats that have that kind of same characteristics. So just your overarching idea here, turnovers, something you would like to add before I mention here the top 5 turnover guys here in the league?
I'm interested to know how many turnovers are at the top. I mean, look, if that turnover number is not, you know, egregious, then, you know, maybe I'll be okay with it. Maybe I'll be fine with it. But if that top turnover number starts creeping up to, like, you know, 30, 40, 50, you know, we're going to have an issue here. I don't know if I want to take that many points away.
Yeah. So let's talk about it. Turnover leaders: Johan Mumsen, Reichert Hadding, Brendan O'Connor, JP Smith, and Lance Williams. And the numbers are 38, 33, 32, 32, and 29. And that was Johan Mumsen with the most turnovers at 38.
Oh my god! Wait, look, that is encroaching on exactly the 30s that I was talking about. But hey, it depends how you want to score it, right? Like, we know that turnovers happen every game. Somebody's, you know, and the guys, and maybe this is kind of the, you know, kryptonite of having those big ball players, because those guys are obviously going to be more likely to turn the ball over, you know, drop ball, bad pass, you know, maybe they get it stolen just because they're carrying the ball so often. And you can see it there. I mean, Mumsen, one of the top guys, you know, Reichert Hadding, obviously one of the top guys there. Lance Williams was a great ball carrier. You know, JP Smith, kind of interesting to see him in the mix. I think he's the only 9 there. And so kind of interesting to see him there in that mix. But, you know, it'll be interesting. I think it really depends on how we score this, how we plan on scoring. And I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I'm no genie in the bottle, but you know, like we definitely will have to score this differently than many of the other, and many of the other categories, and maybe closer to, you know, basketball rather than fantasy football.
Right. And I see what's interesting is that I thought that too, Matt, right? Like, I thought that by adding turnovers, when I was initially going into this was, all right, you're going to be able to add a stat that is essentially going to nerf the guys that handle the ball the most.
Yeah.
That's essentially what you're thinking of on an underlying basis. But at least when it came to our fantasy rankings from last season, the names that I expected to be in this top 5 list weren't there. Yes, we had Reichert Hadding where you want to be penalized, but I don't know if I want to be penalizing guys. For example, Rhino Herbst is sitting at the 7th spot, and that's a guy that really didn't do anything else from a fantasy perspective, but you're going to be penalizing because he racked up 28 turnovers over the course of the season, which ends up being, at least in the way that I statted it, at minus half a point, at minus 14 points on the year.
And I mean, look, I'll just say this point is that there's a couple positions where I think we've identified as, pretty low scoring. I think we're going to look at, the front row position, something that we probably need to add a bit more value to. And then we're looking at the halfback position, the 9, the 10 position. And when you look at the front row, and I'm not going to say it, but I'll say it, let's just say front rows don't have the best hands. All right. I'm just speaking from experience.
Well, I was going to go there, here, but yeah.
So, what are we doing? We're kind of all right. We're now going to diminish them more by potentially, them having potentially more likely getting turnovers. And then you look at the 9 and 10 position, these ball handlers, of course, they're going to throw a bad pass once in a while. Of course, they're going to drop the ball once in a while,
Sure.
Even though they've got silky smooth hands, they will drop the ball at some point just because of volume. And, these are two positions that we're looking at as, hey, how do we get these guys more points? How do we get the non-kickers in these positions a bit more points? How do we get the front row position a bit more points? Do we want to kind of add more penalty to two positions that are probably more likely to get turnovers? I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. Again, I say that with also, like, when you look at it and you say, oh, like minus 19 points for the entire year for Johan Mumson because of his turnovers. That sounds like a big value. But then when you take a step away and you look at it at a week-to-week basis, it's a little bit of an easier conversation to have, because by looking at the entirety of the turnovers, you're like, oh crap, like that's a lot of points. You don't want to reduce that many points. But then when you're looking at a week-to-week basis, if a guy has 5 turnovers in a game, that guy shouldn't be performing well on a fantasy level, and that should decide a week. And I think these are stat categories, again, just like the breakdown steals, is that I would look at this more from a week-to-week basis, where an accumulation of turnovers can decide a week, but it's not going to carry your week. I don't think minus 19 points for the guy that had the most turnovers in the league is necessarily a thing that's going to shock the fantasy rugby rankings, and it's not going to shock the whole thing, but it does have an impact.
I mean, to the point, like when we talk about, we want our points to align with, those team of the week releases, those team of the year releases. And when you look at that top 5, I mean, Mumson, I think, was on the team of the week almost every week, right?
Sure.
Was definitely on the first 15 team. Reichert Hadding, you can say the same about him. Lance Williams, I'm sure, found his way onto the team of the week, probably made his way onto the either first 15 or second 15. I mean, these are guys that are top in their position.
Right.
And, whether that's right. And do you know what the other thing is? That we're looking at this just at turnovers. How does this look with all the stats combined? And a little teaser that we'll get to that, but how does this look? We have no idea exactly what the impact of turnovers is until we can look at everything combined and say, okay, you know what, Mumson moved down one ranking because of his 19 points that he lost, or because of the 38 turnovers that he had. And at that point, it's like, okay, yeah, it makes sense. We should penalize these guys for dropping the ball and knocking on, having horrible hands.
Yeah, there's definitely 2 stats that I'd be interested to see. I only have the season totals, but definitely would have been interesting to see from a match-to-match basis, kind of how the consistency of, turnovers and breakdown steals were happening. Were they happening in spikes, or were they happening consistently through the entire year? Because that's obviously going to have an effect on fantasy weeks. Interesting enough, before we move on here, on the last thing here for breakdowns and turnovers. For turnovers, just to go to the point of guys who are ball carrying the most or handling the ball the most are going to rack up the most turnovers, 9 of the top 10 players in the MLR that consisted of both forwards and backs. 9 of the 10 of them had double-digit turnovers when they carried the ball more than 1,000 meters, if that makes sense. So the top 10, 9 of the top 10 ball carry meter players in the MLR last season had double-digit turnovers. So there is some sort of correlation there with the amount that you're running with the ball and the amount that you're turning it over. But again, there's also other factors being had here. One that we'll see here shortly, that, yeah, some positions just don't have as good hands as other positions. One of those being the front row position, who tends to handle the ball a lot around the breakdown. But often sometimes, you know, doesn't necessarily come away with it cleanly. They actually took the biggest hit when it came to average ranking. When we added both breakdown, steals, and turnovers, they on average dropped 30 rankings. They were averaging, the front row position was averaging 10 turnovers a game, 10 turnovers a season, with about 0.8 steals per player per season.
This is a tough one for the front row. Look, they're not in the position to cause breakdown steals. They're not in the position to catch the ball, you know. Hey, this is a tough one for the front row. I'm sorry, boys. You know, this episode is just going to be a hit on you guys. Sorry, Callie. You know, I know you got great hands, but look, you know, somebody's got to take the hit.
Or maybe, hey, Callie could be the anomaly, man. He could be the one forward out there that fantasy managers will be drafting, because he's the one guy that is stealing at the breakdown and not turning it over. Second row having a similar impact there as well, minus 30 in the rankings. Again, a large part of that player profile, they're not the ones stealing the ball, and yeah, they're often handling it in close quarters. I'm trying to be the most like political.
Hey, look, you just gotta go out there and say it. The front row and the second row positions. I'm sorry, guys, but you guys know you guys don't have the best hands. You know, you might catch a bunch of lineup balls, but when it comes from catching a nice little spin pass from 9, sometimes you just throw it at the ground. You know,
I feel like there's a little animosity there when you're playing 9 days. Is that the case? Were there some guys that you're little? Was Jack not good with you sometimes catching the ball?
No. Jack's an anomaly. All right, this guy was a 9 at heart who just happened to get huge. Okay, that's a different story. There's other guys that have been front rows all along, and you know, maybe we'll chat with a few of them. And you know, I won't tell them that they got no hands to their face, but even if I did, they would tell me otherwise and say that I sucked. So that's fine.
And then moving on to the back row position, again, to the flip side of it, this was the position that we knew was going to benefit most from this. Went up 2 in the rankings, literally just 2 positions on average. Average breakdown steals of almost 2 per season, and then around 10.6 turnovers on the year. So when I'm getting the notion of this, I'll quickly go through here. Scrum half minus 12 in the rankings, fly half minus 3 in the rankings, center up 3 in the rankings, back 3 not really having a difference, which actually I was surprised about, because I thought that back 3 would have a lot more turnovers than they had here in the average here. Only 7 on the season.
I'm surprised
maybe that
too,
was just with
look,
the back 3 that I played with in my playing days, but I don't know.
I'm gonna say that the back 3 also does not have great hands. Okay. Yes, maybe you catch some high
Not according
balls,
to these numbers, man.
No, I know. That's why I'm surprised. I'm just saying that sometimes, you know, the ball comes out wide and you've got tons of space, and next thing I know, the ball's knocked on and it's out of bounds. Like you tell me why.
Right.
Why did that happen? You know, you're catching these huge box kicks, but then a spin pass comes and you're throwing it into the dirt. Now, I don't know. I'm not calling names. I'm just saying from experience, sometimes this is the case.
Oh yeah, I guess there's a little bit to dig in there.
Although
yeah,
the 9 position going down 12 spots, not surprised at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think
when I was a 9, I mean, maybe in high school days, I got my head in there. But once we got to the men's league, I was not getting in any breakdown at all. And hey, I made some bad passes too. So no breakdown steals, bad passes. That's not a good combo for these.
Well, that's what's funny, Matt, is that for the front rowers, the second rowers, and the back 3, oh no, it's bad hands. They got bad hands. They can't catch the ball. This ranking's poor for them. For the scrum half, it's not the bad hands. Just like you know,
the scrum half is I don't want to die. Look, I don't want to die. I want to play next week. I want to play next week. I want to play the next minute. I don't want to get knocked out at the breakdown by a flanker that knows how to ruck way better than me. I mean, frankly, I'm not speaking for all the 9s. I'm not speaking for all the 9s out there. But look, I didn't participate in many rucking drills, so I wasn't very good at them. All right.
I'm getting whiffs of a double standard here, but it's okay. We'll move on, Maddie.
Yeah, we can move on, but yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, so there's the average ranking. What I'm getting here for the most part here, having these numbers in front of me, is that by adding this stat, two things. It's a twofold thing. One is that this is a stat that we're adding that is going to not necessarily have an beneficial increase to necessarily the player rankings, but guys that are maybe not keeping up are definitely going to get a hit here. They're going to definitely take a detriment. They're going to drop in the rankings here if they're not keeping up with those breakdown steals and not minimizing those turnovers. It's going to be something that is going to negatively affect, for a large part, these players rather than boost these players up. And then the second part here is that, again, we look at this from a season-long type number stat here, but I think this is more of a stat category that needs to be considered from a week-to-week basis. This is something that's going to impact you in those really fine matchups that are being decided by less than 2, 3, 4 points, single-digit points here. And I think that's where it's going to have the impact.
Overall, we need to see the bigger picture. You know, how do these, because these two are such low scoring, you know, low value, there's not that many turnovers, there's not that many steals in comparison to tackles and carry meters, or meters gained. We need to see how this looks in the entire picture and the bigger picture, because who knows how this affects front rows after tackles and I mean carry meters isn't going to do much for the front rows, but you know, after tackles and stuff like that. So yeah, something that we'll have to look at in the holistic view.
Definitely. And well, that's a perfect segue here. So let's sort of break this down, because I think at this point, Maddie, is we've reached the point where I think we've accumulated enough stat categories here to make an assessment at where we're standing with our MLR stats, how we feel with what we should implement for upcoming seasons. And let's quickly do kind of an overarching kind of refresher and a recap here of what we've done and what our kind of feelings are before that episode where we really dive into the nitty gritty of how all of these stat categories interplay with one another. We went over total tackles and adding season tackles. It sounds like that's a must. The conversation, though, that's being had is whether or not we're weighing tackles too highly or too lightly. Is it a value that we want to have as a full 1 point thing, a 0.5 thing, or is it something that we want to minimize to a 0.1, 0.2 thing? It feels like the general consensus after you were initially kind of on the higher end, and after seeing the numbers and going through a conversation with Vandy 2 weeks ago. Not that
I've been
seesawing you.
I've been seesawing. We put in carry meters. I was kind of back on the 0.5 train.
Sure.
You know, I don't know. I can't make up my mind. That's why we got the people.
Got it. And that's something that we'll consider there. But it does seem that tackles, whether it's 0.5, whether it's 0.25, whether it's 0.1, we are including that if it is accessible to us, correct?
Yes.
Absolutely.
100%.
All right. And then moving on to meters gained, another kind of interesting stat that was there. Again, it kind of had a differing opposite effect to what the total tackles had. So it was kind of nice introducing both of those stat categories on back-to-back weeks, because it feels like by adding total tackles and meters gained at the same time, you're bolstering the amount of stats and the amount of points that are being had in fantasy, in Major League Rugby, by keeping things pretty even keel and not shifting the landscape of fantasy scoring too drastically by adding these two stats. Meters gained sounds like it's something that's pretty solidified if we can add it to the 2023 year. You agree?
Yeah, no doubt. We need to reward those guys that don't score tries but carry the ball.
Absolutely. And then lastly here, what we spoke about all today was the steals and the turnovers. It sounds like we're a little bit on the fence on both of those things right now.
I mean, I love steals.
I do love steals.
And turnovers is growing on me. That's what I'll say.
Sure.
I think understanding that, hey, it's not going to be a big portion of the scoring, but it may be, you know, maybe it's something to just think about in the back of your mind that might lose you a week, or maybe, you know, lose you a championship. You never know.
And hey, it could happen in real life, man. You could be in the biggest match in the MLR, and a turnover could decide the fate of either team. Should happen in fantasy rugby too, so there's that to keep in mind as well. But yeah, to that point, Matt, it's about looking at it from a week-to-week basis. I think that's the biggest differing thing between the stats that we went over the past 2 weeks. With the tackles, with the meters gained, you'll have players that will solely get their fantasy points off of tackles. You'll have fantasy players that will solely get their points off of meters gained. you're not going to have, I think, significant fantasy contributors of guys that are solely stealing at the breakdown or losing you fantasy weeks by solely getting turnovers. They may decide it because you may lose by 2 points, but it's not going to be a player that is going to absolutely wreck or completely carry your week with these two stats. So I think, we won't know the official answer until we incorporate all of it together here. But definitely an interesting conversation to continue to be had. So I think in the upcoming episodes, we'll try to incorporate all of it: tackles, meters gained, breakdown steals, turnovers. And then I think now we've reached that portion, Matt, where now we start to fine tune and tweak things here. And if there's anything else that you'd like to add, now's the time to kind of test it out. And maybe we're overlooking something. So
one thing I know that we're going to have to look at is, how can we up those set pieces, those defenses, you know?
That is. And that actually a good segue to close out the show here. We have it every single week. This week, we decided to have it towards the tail end here. The Ask TFR show question by enlightening the people about fantasy rugby and the MLR, just a way to kind of spur the conversation about fantasy rugby. And the question coming into us this week, we went through all the stats and we talked heavily about the players. And we did have a position last season, the set piece for the teams that we had to incorporate into our fantasy lineups. Really didn't have that big of a fantasy significance. Really, it was only the try assist off of set pieces, and then also the bonus point for either losing within a score or winning, or by scoring more than 4 tries. So really, the defenses were not having, I don't think any defense scored more than double digits, I think, last season. I'll have to go back and look, but I can't imagine that happened.
I mean, it might have been the one time that the SaberCats scored like 4 more tries, but
possibly, we'll see. But overall, just to quickly wrap up the show, quick question here is just, what would you like to see from this set piece position? Is this something that you see that is good with the way it's at, having that minimal advantage, really not making a big difference in your fantasy weeks, but hey, could have a deciding factor in it? Or is the set piece position something you want to see have more of a fantasy impact?
Hey, I think we need to have line-out steals. We got to have line-out, I guess, losses.
Yep.
There's also as well scrum steals, scrum losses, or scrum turnovers, I guess. In addition to what we had last year with the try assist and stuff like that, maybe that there is, it just adds a little bit more in kind of the importance of the set piece, right? You want set pieces that have high percentage lineouts, high percentage scrum win percentage. Those are the set pieces that you want to pick up that translates into the game. Those are the things that we want to make sure that we're including in our scoring. And then, I think we talked about this in one episode that maybe, you look at total tackles in a game, but, that's less related to set piece, more if you look at it as a defense. But I think line out percentage and and scrum percentage wins definitely something that we need to try and incorporate in there. That set piece stats.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I would love, as commissioner, I would love to kind of bake in more fantasy points into that set piece position. And again, I'll remind all the listeners and all the people just starting to get into fantasy rugby and the MLR as we try to create and shape this thing into exactly the game that we want to create it into. It's about mimicking what we see on the field, and set piece has a big part in the game of rugby, and we want to make sure that's exemplified and that's reflected in fantasy rugby as well. So we want to do that too. That's why we're introducing all these stats, tackles, meters gained, breakdown steals, turnovers, because we want fantasy rugby to reflect the actual game of rugby as much as possible. And by baking in more of these stat categories is just the way we're going to do that. Obviously, there's a right way to do it, and that's why we're having this conversation. But I do think we are on the right track, and I think the next step, I think after doing all these player stuff, is to then now have a closer look at the set piece. But until then, though, we're going to come out with the rankings. We're going to bake all these in. We're going to bake it all into one good ranking here, see where the players stand, and then we'll figure out whether or not where we're at right now with the categories that we've introduced when it comes to tackles, meters gained, breakdown steals, turnovers, and the points values that we've introduced with them. Are they the kind of the right direction that we're headed in? Do things need to be changed now that they are all in the same ranking, now that they're all being accounted for? That's something that we're going to find out in a very near episode.
Just going to say, hopefully we have the very experienced, the very knowledgeable, the man full of all the rugby knowledge, Vandy, on the show to provide his input, because, That guy is a man of vast rugby experience.
Well, now after a year of Fantasy Ruckers under his belt, for sure,
Yes.
dude, that guy's a rugby expert.
Yes, and
we're like two proud parents, man.
And future
It's like
MLR star.
Seeing Vanny grow into the rugby aficionado that he's become over the past 37 episodes. It's been a journey. It's been absolutely great.
It has.
But yeah, definitely some fun times along the way too. So you'll expect that in episodes to come. We'll come down with that full top 10, top 50, top 100 ranking of all those players introduced with those new stat categories. We're also hopefully going to have interviews in the next few weeks here of certain players around the league, get their thoughts on the MLR, the past MLR draft, their thoughts on fantasy rugby in Major League Rugby as well, and continue to get interconnected with the league and continue trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. Anything else for you, Matt?
Look, I'm going to just finish off the episode with the good old just preaching back to the choir that, hey, email us MLR.
There we go. We're here for you, MLR. If you want fantasy rugby in Major League Rugby, you'll want to reach out to the Fantasy Ruckers, right?
Oh, yes, you
That's
do.
where it is. All right. For Matt Yee, for Devin Vandy Vanderpool, who will be back soon, I am Ryan Yee. We'll see you next week.
Where's Gilchrist?
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.